With you, physical, digital. We're going to take a look at the Tower of Babel, Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 to 9. Now, I'll get into that. Let's see here. Sorry, Genesis chapter 11. And then we'll jump back to Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east. By the way, if your translation says to the east, it's actually from the east is correct. I know there are different translations, but it literally means from the east. In other words, they're heading west. That they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, "Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they all have one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the people of the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. And so, is it the Tower of Babel? Is it the Tower of Babel? Babel is closer to the truth. The English say Babel, the Americans say Babel, and the actual Hebrew word is Bavel, transliterated as Babel. And so we don't actually have a translation. We don't even have connection. Sorry about that. One of my mentors is Australian, and after you hang around with them in Canada and then the United States and then the UK and digging fossils and dinosaurs, it starts to rub off, and all of a sudden you're speaking in an Aussie accent and you don't know what happened to you. And so a psychological warning if you hang around Australians. But let's see. Okay, so we do. So this morning we're going to be talking about the brief history of mankind, evidence for the Tower of Babel dispersion. And I've just read the main account in Genesis chapter 11, verse 1 to 9. Now, Nimrod, we read about him in Genesis chapter 10. And these two chapters are not chronological, by the way. So we have the events, Genesis chapter 11, and then we have the aftermath in Genesis chapter 10, the dispersion of all the nations from the Tower of Babel. And so Nimrod was actually the great-grandson of Noah, and he was the one that apparently was in charge of this rebellion against God. So Genesis chapter 10 in verse 1 says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth." And so if we jump down to verse 6, we see about who Ham's offspring were. And the sons of Ham, Cush, and so on. And then verse 8, "And Cush begat Nimrod. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, which is Uruk in secular history, and Akkad, which is Akkad in secular history with K's instead of C's, and Kelna, which we're not 100% sure exactly where that is." And so this coincides with the ancient history and archaeology of the southern portion of Mesopotamia. And so when we're talking about Shinar in the Bible, because we read that they journeyed from the east, they're heading west, into the land of Shinar, this would be this area here. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning. So let's just, I want to go back through those verses. So, and it came to verse 1 of chapter 11. "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech." And so there wasn't a whole bunch of different languages. There was one language. They spoke the same language. Verse 2, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. I want to take a look at that word dwelt. It's the Hebrew word yashev. It means to sit down, to remain, to dwell, or to settle. They were putting down roots. Now, we can't forget that in Genesis chapter 9, and we can just take a look at that. Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, and God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We see that's actually repeated from Genesis chapter 1, the command that was given to Adam and Eve in verse 28, Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, and God blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and so on and so forth. And so this commandment is given again because everything was starting over again after the flood. Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, if you're going to fill the earth, you need to be moving out. And what happens here is they rebel against God and they yashev. They put down roots. We're not going anywhere. And they started urbanization in ancient Mesopotamia, which is not the beginning of humanity, but it's a place of rebellion shortly after the flood. So they get off the ark from the mountains of Ararat, mountains in this ancient kingdom known as Urartu. Now, personally, I think it's Greater Ararat. And there's some information in my Flood Fossils book on that. But nevertheless, and they start to migrate. And I've done some calculations. I think that they were migrating pretty much on a regular basis, like maybe even every day, because from where the ark landed to where they enter the land of Shinar was about 106 years. And so in order to make that journey in 106 years, you have to be making some movement every day or every other day, longer journeys. Nevertheless, about 106 years later, here they show up, and we see this rebellious spirit. Move out, fill the earth. No, we're going to put down roots. We're going to build cities. We're staying here. We're not moving anymore. Verse 3. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and slime, that's the King James, slime had they for mortar. Now your translations may just tell you exactly what it is, but it's the Hebrew word hamar, which means bitumen or asphalt or tar. And so they made the bricks out of clay, they burnt them, and so they fired them, and then they had in between the bricks tar, asphalt, for the mortar. And you say, well, why the bricks? Well, it's actually not that easy in that area to find good rock to quarry for building. But there was a lot of clay. And so it seems that and you'll find a lot of these ancient buildings were made of fired bricks in that area, Iran, etc. Verse 4, and they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And so God says, you need to scatter, right? You need to move out. You need to fill the earth. And they wanted to make a name for themselves so that they didn't have to follow the ultimate authority of God. And it says they built a tower. They wanted to build this tower to heaven. What does that really mean? When you take a look at what the cultures of that time actually believed as far as the makeup of the earth, the solar system, the universe, all of that, and this is not the biblical view, they took what the Bible said and they twisted just a little bit. And so they have this disk, that's the earth. They have this solid dome. And in their mindset, they had the sun, moon, and stars are anchored in that solid dome. And right up above that's the dwelling of God, or their gods. And so I think what they wanted to do, and the Bible doesn't give us all these details, so there is a bit of supposition here, but I'm looking, what does that mean unto heaven? Because the Hebrew word there is shamayim. This I am at the end, usually in Hebrew means it's plural, but the interesting thing is there is no singular version that doesn't have the I am. So it's always shamayim, and you have to look at the context. Which is why, you see, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth in some translations, and others say, no, that's the heavens and the earth. We have three heavens, according to Scripture. We have where the birds fly, We have where the sun, moon, and stars are. That's the second heaven. And we have the third heaven where God dwells. Remember, Paul says, I knew a man several years ago. He was caught up to the third heaven. In other words, some people think that might have been Paul. One of the times he was stoned to death or shipwrecked or whatever it was. Nevertheless, there's the first heaven, a second heaven, and third heaven. And I think that they wanted to build this tower literally to the third heaven to be at least equal with God, if not greater than God, make a name for themselves so they wouldn't have to scatter. Now, even in their view of the universe and how it was made up, you can only build a tower so tall before it starts to collapse on its own weight. But nevertheless, the key point here is they wanted to place themselves in preeminence over God so they didn't have to obey him. Verse 5, and I really like verse 5. So you have to understand, here they are, we're going to build this tower, we're going to make a name for ourselves, we're going to become equivalent or better than God. We don't have to listen to him anymore. And then we have verse 5, and the Lord came down. Now we know God knows everything, God sees everything, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, he's omnipresent. We know that. But in the way it's worded here, he has to come down to see this insignificant little tower that men were building. Now, of course, we know he knew exactly what they were doing. But it's kind of this condescension about the arrogance of mankind. Verse 6. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they all have one language. And this they begin to do, and nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Verse 7, go to, let us go down. Now, I was reading some commentary material early on in this, and one guy said, well, who's the us? He said, I think God was talking to the angels. Let us go down. As if, God needs, a couple bodyguards with him to go down and take care of things. No, I don't think so. Just as we saw in Genesis chapter 1, and it's also mentioned later on in Genesis chapter 1, let us make man, right? And so I think this is the reference to the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, verses later, somewhere around 24, 25, here we have it here again. Let us go down and there confound their language that they may not understand one another's speech. Verse 8, so the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Notice, when you go through, you'll see that they were building a city and a tower. There was a mention of a city and a tower, and it says they left off to build the city. They stopped. And so this tower is associated with a specific city, which we'll see. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. In this verse, we get a glimpse into the origin of the name Babel itself. And so we're back in Genesis chapter 11, and we're in verse 9. And it says, therefore is the name of it called Babel. The Hebrew is Bavel. And that's actually a transliteration directly from the Hebrew. It's not translated. Which is why a lot of people are confused about where was the tower. That word in Genesis chapter 10 and Genesis chapter 11 is transliterated, so English letters, or in this case it would be Hebrew letters originally, actually the English letters, are used to pronounce the Hebrew word. If you translate it, as we'll see, it's very clear where this tower was built. But the other interesting thing is we have this word Babel, or Bavel, and I believe it was coined right here because we read on, because the Lord did there confound the language. And so let me just insert two Hebrew words there. Therefore is the name of it called Bavel, because the Lord did there balal, the language of all the earth. And this Hebrew word balal means to intermingle, especially of liquids. And so they called the place from there on in Babel, or translated Babylon. It's interesting because we see all the people here, they want to reject God, they want to do their own thing, and what's the ultimate result? Confusion. It's exactly the same today. When people want to do their own thing, they don't want to follow God, they're not interested in what the Bible says, often we see confusion. But if we want clarity, we need a person by the name of Jesus Christ to come forgive us of our sins, and that we have to ask for forgiveness, make a decision to follow him the rest of our lives. Let's continue on and take a look at some evidence here. So when we take a look at biblical history, we have design. Things are well designed to multiply after their own kind. Death, disease, disaster come into the world because of sin and the curse. The world becomes so bad during the days of Noah that he sends a deluge, a worldwide flood. And here we are after the flood. Sometime, we don't know exactly how long it took Nimrod to rise to power, but they got there 106 years after the flood, and it was sometime after that. No, we're not going to listen. We're going to rebel. We're going to build this tower. And then we have deliverance through Jesus Christ. And depending on what you do with Jesus affects your destiny. It's eternity in one place or another. Eternity in heaven, because Jesus Christ has basically covered your sins, or eternity in hell. A lot of people don't like that other portion, only the good news. So let's take a look at this. If people really did live together after the flood at a place called Babel or Babylon, southern Mesopotamia, and they dispersed from there, then we would expect to find evidence in so-called isolated people groups of common technology. They had it at Babel, they dispersed, and you see different, supposedly isolated people groups with the same technology. That's one of the things you might find. Another thing you might find is common practices among so-called isolated people groups. You might find common symbols among those so-called isolated people groups. You might find common architecture, maybe replicas of the Tower of Babel. Now, this is how I do research. I look at the scripture and I say, what does it say? And then I go out into the world and say, do we find evidence that that actually happened? And the reality is, yes, we do. This was one of the passages that when I first became a Christian, I believed everything in the Bible, but Genesis 1 to 11 about the building of this tower, I said, well, that's not possible. I had problems with it. And of course, I didn't understand that what they wanted to do and what they actually did were not always the same thing. And finally, I didn't think you'd build a tower. When I'm saying heaven, I'm thinking up to the stars, right? And it doesn't specifically tell us that. It could be where the birds fly. It could be, where they thought the sun, moon, and stars were. It could be up to God, where he dwells. Well, let's start with common technology. Unbeknownst to many people, boomerangs have been found worldwide. Not just something in Australia, the Australian Aboriginals, but worldwide. And so here I am. I'm in one of the major cities there in Australia, and we have this guy, and he's playing the didgeridoo. He's really good. And so notice he has a microphone too, right? And a friend of mine who's from Australia, he said, that's you got a white-skinned Aborigine there. I said, well, he does have blue eyes, so there is something there. But nevertheless, I think he definitely has heritage in that direction. And so when we think of Australia, we have particular perceptions and conceptions of Australia. Now, I was there in 2018. I was speaking at a very large conference there, and I wanted to get a boomerang. And so every street corner, my poor wife, I must have looked at thousands of boomerangs. But I learned a little trick. If you want a boomerang, it's actually made by the Aborigines. Turn it over to the backside. And if it says it's made in Indonesia, it's not made by the Aborigines, right? And those also won't return, by the way. They'll throw nice, but they won't return. Not all Australian Aborigine boomerangs returned. There were some tribes that had returning ones and other tribes that didn't, and they pretty much looked the same unless you knew what you were really looking for. And so here we have, an old picture here, and here are some boomerangs. I have one Australian Aborigine boomerang on the table here. I have several in my collection. And you'll notice that they have ones that are typically returning boomerangs. Now this one, which is longer on one side, is a non-returning boomerang. Now the returning boomerangs, one of the things that they did is they hunted birds. And so with the returning boomerang, they would spread out a net. They would throw the boomerang, and the sound as it went over the birds would scare them down into the net. They'd catch it, and then they would do it again. But if an Australian Aboriginal has one of these aimed at you, it's longer on one side than the other, run, duck, dodge to the left, to the right. That's a killing boomerang, okay? It's a non-returning. And here's another, and it's called the number 7. And those are used in warfare and things like that. And, you know, guys got a little shield there. You can hook it like this and pull the shield out of their hands. And they're very heavy. You don't want to get hit by one. I've got one in my collection as well. Egypt. Now, this guy's pretty famous today, King Tut, Tutankhamun. And when they excavated his tombs, they found that there were boomerangs in his tombs. Now, it shouldn't have really been a surprise, because when we look at the hieroglyphics, here's a hieroglyphic. This piece is in the British Museum, and a snake-like throwing stick. And here's another more typical, what we might think of returning boomerangs. And actually, one of the head Egyptologist in charge of King Tut's boomerangs says that some of them, if thrown correctly, will return. And so we have returning boomerangs not only in Australia, but also here apparently in Egypt, according to the head Egyptologist of King Tut's boomerang collection. And so we find hieroglyphics, but we have the actual, and so these are Australian Aboriginal boomerangs up here for comparison. And so there's a snake-like one. There's a more typical returning type one. These are all King Tut's. So there's the hieroglyphic, there's the actual artifact, hieroglyphic, actual artifact. We also find boomerangs in India. And so this is a collection. If you ever go to England and you're anywhere near Oxford, check out Pitt Rivers Museum. One of the most amazing museums I've ever been in. Tons of stuff. It was 70 or 700,000 artifacts that are in storage, okay? And it's kind of old school. This is from India, here, here, and here. And so the evidence seems to be that at least one of the groups in Australia didn't invent the boomerangs. As we saw, they had them in Egypt too, but actually took them from India when they migrated over to Australia. The United States. Now this is a Hopi Native American. Notice he has what they call a rabbit stick, and notice what he killed with it. So small animals, and here are a couple others here. And I have a museum quality reproduction up here of one that actually is in the Smithsonian. And so some of these are reproductions, others are real. If you want to know which is which, just ask me. I don't have those on the labels. Moving on to France. And so boomerangs have been found in France, various different parts of Europe. This is a museum quality reproduction that I had done for the book I'm working now on, and that's on the table there if you'd like to take a look at that. And the original was found in France. Now, ancient Assyria. Now, it's interesting, when you take a look at some of the translations of some of these texts, you hear about throwing sticks. And so throwing stick was just a common word. And then you have Gilgamesh. Now, some people say, well, he's got a lion here and he's got a snake here. And then if you take a close look at the head, I don't think that's a snake head, but why would the body be shaped like that? I personally think, that, as some other scholars do, that this is a throwing stick. This is their version of the boomerang, originating back in ancient Mesopotamia or where the Tower of Babel was built, etc. Boomerangs have been found all over the world. So there we have Australia, there we have USA, and it looks like they got off the same vessel. I won't say boat because the ark was a box or a chest. And they have the same technology. They're operating basically the same way, and not just with boomerangs, but with many other things that I'm going to talk about today. And so we have found boomerangs in places like Poland and various places in Africa and Germany and Australia. There's the ones from Egypt, Africa again, the United States, and I have a big long list, and many of these will be shown in the book, examples from around the world. Very peculiar type of technology. It requires an airfoil like an airplane wing, and the returning ones require other adjustments in order to have them return. And so it is exceedingly unlikely that people from all over the planet invented simultaneously, apart from one another, the same instrument, the same weapon, boomerangs. Boomerangs have been found in places such as Holland, Scandinavia, Denmark, Switzerland, Poland, Germany, Greece, Egypt, India, Indonesia, Africa, South America, the United States, Australia, and other places all over the world. Now, I was reading a secular dissertation on the origin of boomerangs, and I have no reason to believe that the gentleman was a Christian, thinking from Scripture, but he said, it looks like the boomerang originated in ancient Mesopotamia. I agree. And particularly at the Tower of Babel. And then they dispersed from there, carried these things all over the world with them. Atlatls, this is another interesting device, and those are also on this table, but at the end, the longer ones there. And what this actually does is it adds an extra digit to your arm. And then the Native Americans actually perfected it by adding weights to them, and so that caused the atlatl to bend, and you had a large dart. Some people call it spear thrower. They're not really spears. They're large darts. They're like large arrows. And as they would throw it with that weight on there, it would bend back. The dart itself would bend, and you had spring on spring. And they could throw these up to 100 miles per hour. And you find this technology all over the world. It's a very peculiar, unique, but successful technology all over the world. And so here's what it would look like. There he has the atlatl and he has the dart. And so this is known as the spur of the atlatl, which connects to the dart in several different ways. And they can hunt all kinds of things with it. It was the one thing that when the Spanish conquistadors came over into Central America that they were afraid of, were the natives had atlatls. And it is said, and I don't know, you might have to check on this, but that it could penetrate the metal armor that they were wearing, right? And so they were actually afraid of this weapon, even though they had guns. So here we have USA, Papua New Guinea, Mexico, Australia, Canada. And so if you think of the Inuit in their kayaks, and they have this device that they're going to harpoon a whale or whatever it is with it, that's what they're using to throw it, an atlatl. And that's one in our collection. That's authentic. That's up at the front here. Common practices. Now, this is a strange one, and it's important that you don't pick things that, they might have been able to come up with that independently, but artificial cranial deformation, I prefer to call it intentional cranial deformation, because some of the bonnets that they put on children in Europe, they had tied quite tightly, and it actually deformed the skulls, but it wasn't intentional. It was artificial. And so what I'm talking about is intentional. They were intending to change the shape of the skulls. And so we'll start in Peru, because this is probably one of the most famous places in the world. I've been to Peru at least 3 times that I remember. I might have to think a little. I think 3 times. And here we have the Shankai. Lived a similar time frame as when that tapestry was made, about 1000 to 1450 AD. And notice he has a cone head. You might say, well, maybe that's just a hat. Maybe it's artistic license, except for the fact that you find actual skulls in the tombs, especially in regions like Paracas, but literally all over Peru, into Bolivia, into Chile, into Argentina, South America, these elongate skulls. And there are some Christians that say, those are hybrids of humans and the Nephilim mentioned in Genesis chapter 6. I totally disagree. These are humans, period, that have had their skulls elongated. Now, there'll be questions that are probably entering your mind or will enter your mind soon. Here's another one here. Very peculiar practice. And so in Peru, they had several different ways. They would use boards. Then they would tie. And this was shortly after birth, right? So from birth, and the longer that you kept it on and the more pressure you put it on, the more pointed you could get the heads. And so we see this in Iraq and Iran as well. This is one of the mechanisms that was used. So we have this padding here. We have these ropes. Here's another one. And so several different techniques were used to do this in Peru. And you find the skulls, you find the head binding material. This was done to their children. Here's an apparatus with the actual skull in it, found in Argentina. And so the Mayans used a similar mechanism made out of wood, pressure from the front to the back. Egypt. And so if we look closely at King Tut. So here's a scan of a skull. Notice how it's elongated back here. This was found in his tomb, apparently was a younger version of King Tut. He had a skull bound. You can see where the wrappings were, indenting the skull. Now, this is Akhenaten and Nefertiti and 3 of their daughters. And this was on display in Berlin at the Egyptian Museum there. And we come in, and there are big spotlights on this piece of rock. And there was a gentleman standing there. And if I didn't know better, I would think that he was supplicating to his gods. Right? We have this show, the ancient astronauts, the ancient aliens. And the reality is that you need actual evidence to make claims, and they make claims based on what they call evidence. And I've looked at all of that. I've looked at the skulls. And it's not. They're humans. They're simply humans. And so here we have 3 of their children. Take a close look here. And I suspect, although I don't know, and my wife's like, "How do you know that?" Well, I don't. I suspect that he thought these were aliens. Human-alien hybrids, or on the Christian side, some Christians think these are Nephilim human hybrids. I don't believe so. I don't believe they are. You don't see Nephilim mentioned in the Old Testament prior to, I believe it's Numbers chapter 13, I think. And then just before it mentions the Nephilim there, it tells you right in the first sentence that this was a false report. In Hebrew, it's a dabah. Sounds like Klingon, but it is Hebrew. It's a false report. And so there's no indication of Nephilim before, no indication after, only this one place where it says right in the first sentence, this is a false report. Okay, so I don't believe they lived after the flood, which a lot of Christians think they did. Now, extreme binding. This was one of the daughters of Nefertiti and Akhenaten. This is a carving, obviously. Why? Why was this done? Well, one of the reasons is affiliation with a certain tribe. Okay, you come to another was for the aesthetics of it. And in Egypt, it's thought that this was done in private. So that plaque would have hung in their private quarters. It wouldn't have been a public thing. And so you have, they're the royals. So they've had their head bound. And you actually find the same thing in Peru, and they dig up these elongate skulls, and they say, "Oh, well, he was the tribe head." And so the Peruvians say, "Yeah, no, that's why it was done." So to indicate importance in this sort of thing. But aesthetics. And so we know about the beehive, right? And I mean, I had a mother, and I watched the back combing and the hairspray. And then even there were plastic implements you could buy at the drugstore. And you could put it in, and you comb your hair over top to make it look nice and big. And I agree, it's aesthetically pleasing. Maybe not in style right now, but still in style in Texas. But anyway, here's what happens. This is a reconstruction I had done of one of the elongate skulls from Peru. And this skull is known as Cinnamon. It was a young woman. And so we had a reconstruction done. And if you notice, you have the same kind of idea with the hair. And so a lot of these Victorian hairdos in Europe, especially in France, and you see paintings and things, in some cases that was hair. But in other cases, they had bound the skulls of the girls so that they would have this beautiful looking hair. And of course, the hair covers the elongate skull. It's not quite as dramatic as when you're looking at just the skull without hair. In the United States, so here we have the Chinook, Native Americans, and they have the papoose. Now, papoose can refer to the baby, but it often refers to the carrier of the baby. And the Chinook added this extra piece here, which is a board, and they would tie it and keep tightening it until they also ended up with the elongated heads. This was done on Vancouver Island. I have photographs, actual photographs of the natives there with their heads bound all the way through the United States, South America, Central America, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and so on and so forth, worldwide. So here's one of the skulls. This is from the United States. This is a cast. I do not keep human remains, but this is a cast of an original showing you the elongation. Vanuatu. And so here we are in Vanuatu, and there are some Brits that are making movies. They have these little airplanes. They got caught, one tribe caught them, and anyway, they got released. But in Toman Island in Vanuatu, they noticed how it was done. They were binding the heads of the children. In fact, they even had hats to put on over top of the binding, these big conical hats. And here's a young boy who had his head bound. 1928, Vanuatu. And actually, it didn't stop. Some places continued this into the 20th century. Here we have China. This is a fairly new skull that was found. And usually there's not just one, there's usually multiple. And so I contacted the gentleman that wrote this scientific paper and said, hey, I see this is your photograph. Can I use it? Sure. And so we have an agreement to use that. And Africa, so this was being done in Africa all the way up to at least the 1950s. And so here we can see a couple examples, cut off by the top of the screen, I guess. But Shinar, so Iraq, southern ancient Mesopotamia, Shinar. And I got a technical book, and I found out that, hey, guess what? They found layer upon layer upon layer of people in ancient Iraq, which is where the Tower of Babel was built, and they all had their skulls elongated by intentional cranial deformation. Here's one of them. This was practiced all over the world. Now, it's such a peculiar practice to suggest that this came about more than once in all of these places all around the world just does not make logical sense. It seems as though this was practiced in one area and then it dispersed, and we already know that that one area, based on archaeological evidence, is Shinar, where the Tower of Babel was built. Head binding worldwide, this is found in places such as Australia, Melanesia, Africa, France, United States, Central America, South America, basically the entire globe. The entire globe practiced this in ancient times up until the 20th century. Let's move on to common symbols. Swastikas. So some have come up here and wondering, okay, where is this going? What's with the swastikas? Well, it's a symbol that's found all around the world. And so here's a hockey team. You can see that Mum probably had something to do with the sewing of the jerseys. They're not all identical. Some are going counterclockwise, some are going clockwise. Now, technically, clockwise is a swastika, and counterclockwise is svastika, but I just call them all swastikas because only in the 19th century were they interested in those intricate details, and those are the scholars. And this is not Hitler's hockey team. These are the Windsor swastikas from Nova Scotia in 1909. And then here in Alberta in 1916, we had a women's hockey team in Edmonton that were also known as the swastikas and also had jerseys like this. Now, I am not suggesting, and we're just getting started here, I'm not suggesting that we resurrect this symbol and make lapel pins and run around with this symbol. But what is the history of it? And so that's what we want to look at. United States. This is a Pima Native American basket with the swastika. Now, swastika comes from the Sanskrit, which loosely translated as good fortune. And this was being used all over the world in ancient times, all the way up to modern times until World War II, when it was eventually outlawed, for obvious reasons. Now, the Hopi Native Americans explain what this symbol is. Now, I walked into a store probably a couple decades ago in the southwest portion of the United States, and they had a big carpet in there, and it had swastikas on it. And these were all Native American artifacts. And I said to the lady, who was also Native American, I said, what's with the swastikas on the carpet? Well, I just got thrown out of the store, okay? And she looked at me and she said, those are, and I quote, those are not swastikas. Those are the whirling logs of the Navajo Indians, end quote. So I had been corrected. They don't call them swastikas. They call them the whirling logs. And when you take a look at what the Hopi believe, the Hopi people, you know, the guy with the boomerang in one hand and the rabbit in the other, they say the center of the whirling logs is when all the people were in one place at one time. Then they separated and they dispersed in opposite directions. Then they separated and moved even further away from each other, and they say that the swastika, or the whirling logs, is the symbol of the migration of the Hopi people. Now, archaeologists say that's the symbol of the migration of the people within the United States. Maybe. But I think maybe it's a symbol of the migration from even further away, perhaps even the Tower of Babel. Nevertheless, that's what they say about the symbol. And you'll find that in different places, the symbol's called different things. And so I have a pin here from Latvia, and they call it the Thunder Cross. And then you'll go to Europe, and you'll find engravings of priests and whatnot, and they will have the Thunder Cross, or the swastika, on their robes. And so they were told by the United Nations, no more giving out toques and mitts with the Thunder Cross, or the swastika on it. Italy. Now, this is a legitimate Greek vessel. It's up on the table over there, and you can see the swastika that dates to before the time of Christ. Ghana, Africa. These are bronze weights that were used to measure gold dust. Some of these are on the table up here from the Ashanti or Akan culture in Africa. Roman swastikas. And so, speaking of lapel pins, we have an ancient Roman lapel pin there with the swastika, a couple of rings that have swastikas on. So this was a very common symbol. We moved to Japan, and in Kyoto, Japan, they tore down a temple, and I saw a part of the temple. It's on the table over here for sale. They actually had 3. I figured I didn't need 3. 1 would probably be sufficient. And there it is. If you can get an orientation with these older ones, you'll notice there's a flat surface, and then it's kind of sitting like this. It's not up on end like a diamond. That typically is how they were being depicted, although there are exceptions. When the Socialist Party of Germany originally had it sitting like this, and then they tipped it up, and then Hitler came to power. And so it wasn't really Hitler, it was the Socialist Party of Germany that took the symbol up, and that's basically when it fell into disuse for obvious reasons, because people immediately think Hitler, Socialist Party of Germany, World War II, etc. Korea. When you go to Asia, you'll find that theirs are just slightly different, and this is a temple that dates back to the 16th century, and if you look close, you can see here the swastikas, and they have this little extra end. And you'll see that on the Chinese artifact. There's over there's a Chinese artifact. It's basically a chalk line. And so they put chalk in a little container, stretch it out, snap it for building masonry stuff. That's antique, obviously. Nepal. And so here's a sindoor box. And sindoor, the Hindu people, they'll take the sindoor and they'll put it here, or they'll put it in the part of their hair. And so those actually mean something. And so you're like, oh, hey, look, you know, he's got a wedding ring, she's got a wedding ring. And so you, oh, they're taken, they're married, right? And so it's kind of a cultural thing. The original sindoor was poisonous, which is the reason I mention that is don't lick your finger, dip it in, and taste it like my friend did. He tastes everything, and I said, Harry, that's probably poison. You shouldn't do that. He's still alive, by the way. Nevertheless, you'll see the symbol there. Afghanistan, these are some of the oldest artifacts I have, and these are early post-flood. I have other artifacts from early post-flood from the same area, pots and stuff like that with a swastika on it. These are carnelian beads that have been etched with a basic solution. Moving into Iraq, now I don't know if you realize that we keep moving closer and closer to where the Tower of Babel was built. And here we end up in a place called Samarra, Iraq. And this is said to be really, really old. I would say it's very early post-flood. And so here you have the symbol here. And the animals themselves, actually, if you outline them, are actually also in the shape of a swastika, which I find interesting because we have tribal groups from BC that did exactly the same thing. They used this, but they also did this. And we have an original basket from them up here showing the swastika on it from British Columbia. Common symbols. This is exactly what we'd expect to find based upon the biblical record. All of these unique things in all these so-called isolated people groups. Why? Because they all go back to one place, the Tower of Babel, only a few thousand years ago. And so this is not all of them. I just pulled this off the internet to show where some of these swastika artistic symbols have been found. Common architecture, and we're going to finish with this section. Pyramids. Pyramids are found all around the world, and as I mentioned, the ancient astronaut theorists, ancient alien show, etc., they say that aliens came and taught humanity how to build pyramids. Okay. Why? Why don't you show them how to make laser guns, or, how to catch animals, with sound waves, or why pyramids? Well, it's interesting because when you go back and you read Herodotus, he was the father of modern history. He says about the 4th century, so this would have been the restoration, which I'll talk about, of the Tower of Babel. And he says it was a ziggurat, step pyramid, had a central staircase, had a temple at the top. Now, if people dispersed and that was so important to them, don't be surprised that they build replicas wherever they end up around the world with whatever they have as far as building materials. So the Tower of Babel. Now, a lot of people think it's a spiraling tower, but this spiraling tower is actually from Iraq. It's Islamic. It dates to 851 AD. Why did that end up, at least apparent copies of that, in a lot of our Christian artwork? And I think the reason is that the Crusaders came down through this area, and I have to do more research on this to make 100% sure, but I suspect that there was a battle that was fought in Samarra, the Muslims and I say Christians, quote unquote, and they noticed this tower, and so they not only had somebody that would write down what happened, but they'd also draw pictures and things like that. And I suspect that's how this spiraling tower, which is known as the minaret of Samarra, got into much Christian literature, paintings and specifically. So here it is, and at this point it had been reconstructed a bit. So you can now walk up it, which is a little dangerous because last I saw there was no railing on there. And here's a painting of the Tower of Babel. I don't think there's any question. We're looking at the same thing, and this is Gustave Doré, 1865. You can go all the way back to the 1500s, and you can see this. Now, there were some people that knew it was a step pyramid, and I suspect that's because of the writings of Herodotus. But nevertheless, that is not the Tower of Babel. So where was the Tower of Babel? And here we have this word I mentioned, Bavel, and it's transliterated as Babel in your English Bibles. Babel is the English transliteration of the Hebrew word which is translated Babylon everywhere else in the Old Testament. Therefore, this is solid biblical evidence that the Tower of Babel was built in the ancient city of Babylon. A city and a tower, a city and a tower, a city and a tower. That city is Babylon. And so it's literally, if you were to translate it, the Tower of Babylon. Where was Babel? Well, I'm going to read here from Flavius Josephus, only the highlighted portion. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon. And so we have the biblical evidence that it was in Babylon. We have ancient historical evidence from ancient historians that it was Babylon. And we have archaeological evidence that it was in ancient Babylon. This is Professor Andrew George. He is the most scholarly individual on the Tower of Babel in the world, but he's not a believer. And so he has other ideas, of course. An ancient tablet provides the first ever image of the Tower of Babel and offers a very strong piece of evidence that it was a real building. That's according to Dr. Andrew George, professor of Babylonian at SOAS, University of London. The relief that George studied depicts a step-like image of a tower with the text that translates at the temple tower of the city of Babylon. So let me just stop for a second. We had the original tower being built. Then it fell into disarray. And then it was restored on the original foundation in Babylon by two people. Nabopolassar, who was biblical Nebuchadnezzar's father, and Nebuchadnezzar, who's known as Nebuchadnezzar II in secular history. And so let's look at that. So here are some inscriptions that have been translated. And this is Nabopolassar here. At that time, my lord Marduk told me in regard to Adam and Anki, that's what it's called in secular literature, the zikkurat of Babylon, which before my day was already very weak and badly buckled to the ground, its bottom on the breast of the netherworld. And so basically saying, hey, here it is. It needs to be fixed. It's buckled to the ground. Now here we have another circular cylinder, cuneiform cylinder. And this cuneiform cylinder has the inscription of Nebuchadnezzar II, which commemorates the reconstruction of the Tower of Babel, known in secular history as Etemenanke, the major ziggurat found at Babylon. Now here are some more inscriptions. Now it's important to understand that when they were building buildings or restoring buildings, they would make these tablets, they would inscribe them, they would fire them, and they would place them either in the foundation or in the lower walls. And so when you excavate, you find these things and like, oh, that's what was going on. Now this is interesting. This is highly important. The first, which is the house of earth's base, the most ancient monument of Babylon. This is the most ancient building in Babylon. By the way, what was the first building in Babylon? The Tower of Babylon. And he's saying, this is the oldest one. That's what Nebuchadnezzar II said. I built and finished it. I have highly exalted its head with bricks covered with copper. Now, of course, when you fire copper, you end up with this beautiful blue glaze. This is known as the Tower of Babel stele. And let me just read a little bit about this. The stele was found in a special hiding chamber broken into 3 parts in antiquity at Robert Coldaway's excavations of the site of the Tower of Babel in 1917. Now, Coldaway and his team had been working there since the late 1800s. And now 1917, and we have war breakout, as we'll see, its importance was immediately recognized. A photograph was taken with 3 archaeologists standing next to the stele. With the imminent danger of war breaking out in the area, they decided to rescue it, and each archaeologist carried 1 part out of the war zone. 1 part was taken to Germany, 1 part to Jordan, and then London, the 3rd part to the U.S. And only 2 parts remain, as far as I'm aware, and they're in the largest private manuscript collection in the world, the Skuyen Manuscript Collection. I had my artist highlight everything that's still on there. And here we can see the Tower of Babel, what it looked like approximately the 6th century BC after it was restored. And so we have a ziggurat, a central staircase that goes to the 1st level. We have a temple at the top. These are just like building plans today of the temple at the top. And here we have what we believe is Nebuchadnezzar. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 if you count this. And that matches up with Herodotus. He says 8, but Professor Andrew George says this is large enough to actually have internal levels. So a bottom level and an upper level, which would be 8, which would agree with what Herodotus said. Now, here's some interesting stuff. Down here, I was watching an interview of Professor Andrew George, and he said there's an inscription down here. And it says, Etemenanke Zikkurat Babil. Now it's interesting that his ancient pronunciation, at least, of this ziggurat is Babil, and Hebrew is Bavel. And you look at other languages and it's the same, but it's translated into English through the Greek, which is Babylon or Babylon. Translation, the ziggurat of the city of Babylon. There are other inscriptions on here. The house, the foundation of heaven and earth, the ziggurat in Babylon. Etemenanke, I made it the wonder of the people of the world. I raised its top to the heaven, made doors for the gates, and I covered it with bitumen and bricks. Don't forget the original was basically put together with bitumen, tar, asphalt. Here's what's left. Here's what's left of the restoration of the Tower of Babel. There's where the central staircase was, and Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar cheaped out on their bricks. They only did baked bricks on the outside. Those have been removed. This is filled up with water, and these were just sun-dried bricks which are turned back into earth. Here's one of the bricks from the restoration, and when you turn it around, sure enough, there's the bitumen, just like the original was put together with. How tall was it? There are a number of different ancient texts. I'm not going to go into all of those today, but basically from the ground to the top would have been about 300 feet. It was about 300 feet by 300 feet by 300 feet. I say about, some scholars say 91 to 92 meters tall and long and wide. Now, how tall is that? Well, if you go to the Statue of Liberty and you stand down here near the water, from here to the top of the flames is about 300 feet. So it was, in fact, an impressive structure. Did they make it all the way to the heavens? Heaven? Shemayim? No, I don't think so. Which is kind of why God had to come down. They had these great aspirations that they were going to become authorities over themselves. Now, this is a reconstruction that I had 2 Hollywood artists do for me. And this is the ancient city of Babylon. This would be about the 6th century BC, after the reconstruction or the restoration project was complete. And there you can see the blue that was added by Nebuchadnezzar, firing the copper and getting that blue glaze. Stairway to the first level. Now, some think that there were staircases on the outside because of what Herodotus said. Andrew George said they could very well have been on the outside to enter in, and then the staircase is actually on the inside, but the entrance to the staircase is on the outside. So that's what we went with. Most scholars, that's typically how they depict it, although they make a mistake, and they make the walkway to the second level as to the first level. But anyway, I'm particular about stuff like that. So they leave the Tower of Babel. Don't be surprised that you see replicas of this same structure all around the world. The Ziggurat of Ur, and so this may have been one of the early reconstructions or replicas, if you want to call, of the Tower of Babel. Egyptian pyramids. It's interesting when you go to Egypt, you find that the earliest known Egyptian pyramid was a step pyramid at Saqqara. It was a ziggurat. And then after that, they kept changing things. Chinese pyramids. This is known as the Tomb of the General in China, and it's on the border between China and North Korea, and they argue amongst themselves whose general is buried in here. And so it wasn't just the Egyptians, the Chinese were doing the same thing. We have mummification in China, we have it in Egypt, we have it in Peru, and you see these other things that I don't really touch on around the world. And so here are some other Chinese pyramids. These are made out of mounds, by the way. Cambodian pyramids. And so here's one. The temple is gone at the top, but it's a ziggurat, step pyramid, central staircase, and then a temple at the top. And then when we go over to Mexico, it's almost like they had, the same design team or something, because here we are in Mexico on the bottom, here we are in Cambodia and Asia at the top, step pyramid, central staircase, temple at the top. Mexican pyramids. Now there are literally thousands and thousands of pyramids that have not been excavated in Central America, especially from the Mayans. And here's, kind of a tourist place, Palenque, 3rd to 8th century, and they're arguing today, they're changing their minds. Maybe it wasn't a temple at the top. I suspect it probably was. Goes along with all the other ones around the world. Step pyramid, central staircase, temple at the top. Guatemala. And so we went to Tikal. Now Tikal, Guatemala is a very, very well-known place. And tourists, all kinds of tourists. And I said, okay, well, we're going to be at the gate. What time do they open? They said 6 o'clock. I said, well, we're going to be at the gate 15 minutes, 20 minutes before 6. And so we were. And then we had to wait until they opened the gate. And then we sped walked to the area I wanted to take the pictures of, and it was so hazy that I couldn't take pictures for about 2 hours until the sun came down and heated up the land and it lifted out. But it was beautiful just to stand there and listen to the animals and listen to the monkeys and all of these noises around you. Spectacular. Here's temple number 1 at Tikal, the Jaguar Temple. Step pyramid, central staircase, temple at the top. And there was another pyramid opposite of it. Well, let's go to Peru. And this is out in the middle of nowhere, literally, Corral. And they've got all of these tourist things, buy souvenirs and things. And so here's what's left of theirs. Step pyramid, central staircase, temple at the top is gone. And so the guy we hired a guy in town. And I don't know if you've been to Peru, but interesting. So it's hot, they're in T-shirts, and the guys will roll their T-shirts up to here, and then they'll stand on the street corners and they'll be going like this, right? Anyway, so that's our guide. He was doing the same thing. I don't know if it's like a male to male, I don't know. Anyway, showing off my belly, I probably wouldn't do that. But at any rate, he hires this little car, and because he didn't want to drive their van down the roads. I didn't know anything, never been there. So we get going down these roads, and I mean, they are rough. And then all of a sudden, we're in the middle of nowhere, and there's a cow, and there's people bathing in the river, and we got to go through the river, and I think just about tore that car apart. And we finally get there, and like, that's why he hired another guy for $20 American, right, for the whole day. Anyway, I felt bad. I think we bought him some ice cream or something. It's so hot out there. Nevertheless, we have the Tower of Babel. We have step pyramids, ziggurats all around the world. These are just a few places. So this is originally Iraq. We have other versions in Iran, Egypt, the United States, the mound building Indians, as they had been called. You're not supposed to use that word anymore, but it's difficult to find which one is, not discriminatory. But nevertheless, that's a whole other lecture. Mexico, China, all over the world. And so here we have I was going to go on a rant there for a second, but I'll leave it for another time. Tower of Babel in Iraq. So step pyramid, central staircase, temple at the top. Here we are in Cambodia, step pyramid, central staircase, temple. Here we are in Guatemala. It wasn't aliens. They all dispersed from the Tower of Babel, and they were building what they remember from that dispersion point. Pyramids have been found all over the world, in Iraq, Egypt, China, Cambodia, United States, Mexico, Guatemala, and Peru. So we find exactly what we'd expect to find: common technology in so-called isolated people groups, common practices, common symbols, common architecture. And after I'd done a bunch of this research, after at least a decade, I came across this article from 1914, January to March 1914, the American anthropologist, and the author said this: unusual artifacts in places widely separated may point to a common source, though artifacts of almost similar character are best explained by psychological response to similar needs the world over in all ages. In other words, if you find things that are similar but they're not really the same, that just is probably the human brain trying to solve the same kind of problem. And he goes on, he says, there are, however, at least 3 objects which originated in a remote past that would seem to require in each case a common source to which argument from psychology is not applicable. One of these is the cosmic step pyramid found in Egypt, Asia, and America, and many other places, the same in appearance and purpose. Another is the swastika or sun symbol found in Europe, Asia, and America. The third is the boomerang found in ancient Egypt and modern Australia. And I quit counting at 13 or 14 categories. He mentions 3. I went through maybe 4 categories this morning. There'll be a dozen in my book. Now, this is a New Age guy, Richard Casaro, and this is on the cover of his book. A lost wisdom tradition that was practiced globally in antiquity is memorialized in the pyramids and temple architecture worldwide. Casara shows the universality of the world religion. Written in stone will carry you across the mysterious Nile in Egypt to the ancient lands of Persia and China and the dawn of the Indus civilization and southeastern Asian temple pilgrimage. Casaro, your guide on this journey of discovery, is a passionate advocate for the theory that a strikingly advanced mother culture gave birth to spiritual ideas and practices that have nourished humanity since time immemorial. And so when I read that quote from 1914, I said, Lord, why didn't you just give me that to begin with? And I think the reason is he wanted me to see that that's exactly where the evidence is pointing, and even secular New Age scholars see it, but they will never admit it goes back to the Tower of Babel. Genesis chapter 11, verse 1, 4, and 8. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, and they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth. And I was teaching this a number of years ago at a camp. I don't remember if it's junior high or senior high, and a girl in the front row said, how does changing the language make them migrate? I said, well, that's an interesting question. And then I looked at her and I said, Zdrove, koke prietelu. And she kind of looks at me. And I said, imagine there was one language. And all of a sudden, you're in the room with all your buddies, all your friends, all the people you know, some you don't know. And all of a sudden, God changes one language to many languages. I said, before long, you're going to get groups over here that can understand each other, another group over there, another group over there, another group over there. And they're like, I don't even know what happened. We can't talk to anybody. We can't communicate. Tomorrow morning, why don't we head west? Why don't we head east? Why don't we? And all of a sudden, when you can't communicate, what's the point of being together? Right? Now, in a lot of ways, you have to be able to communicate. Which is why I go to restaurants in various countries that have pictures on their menus. Point and order, because every time I go is a different country and a different language. Now here's what we need to understand as far as cultures, people groups. Here we have dad, here we have mom. They both had parents, with one parent that we would call white, one we might call brown, and they had twins. Okay, obviously not identical twins, okay? And one was very dark, brown eyes, dark hair, and the other was blonde, blue eyes, blonde hair. And so the way the genes get put together is very interesting. And so when we go back to Adam and Eve, how did Adam and Eve have all these different races, right? All these different colored people, all these different culture groups. And so Adam and Eve probably would have been a similar medium brown like that. And you see this in India today, where the children can be what we would call white through to what we would call black. And so we're actually not that different. You know, some people say it's skin deep. Well, it's genetics, and a lot of that information is there. And so when people disperse from the Tower of Babel, you break up the gene pool, and you end up with these different cultural groups. Some of them have different characteristics, and you see them doing the same thing. So you go over into Ireland. One of the things I talk about in the book is ear spools. You know, so you put a hole in your ear, you stretch it out. It's becoming common today. But all the ancients used ear spools all around the world. And then you expect that this is in the dark-colored people, right? And then you go to Ireland and you find out that the blonde-haired white guys were doing the same thing in the same time period. The Europeans were doing it too. And so it's not, we dispersed out. We took the same ideas even though we may look different. And so here's these two twins as they grow up a little bit. And so the origin of the different people groups, different colored skin, different, and I went to Korea, and I have kind of Asian-looking eyes. My daughter even more so than me. It's an extra fold in the skin, and it can become a problem when you get older, when it starts to stretch out and then you can't see anything. But, the one lady said, "Oh, you have handsome eyes. I give you a good deal," right? So, and I'm not mocking. I'm just actually, if you know me, I have many accents. But anyway. Yeah, and so she recognized, hey, he's similar. He's a white guy, but he's similar to us. Anyway, it's just kind of interesting. What's the point? Well, the fundamental point of what we do is this. We're all one family. And we all have the same problem called sin. And we all need the same solution, and his name is Jesus Christ. Adam brought sin and death by his disobedience. Jesus Christ came to bring forgiveness of sin and life eternal by his obedience. So if you don't know Jesus, you don't know if you're to die today, you spend eternity in heaven. You can know, if that's the desire of your heart. Talk to one of the pastors here, talk to myself. Again, just to reiterate some of the resources. So if you're interested in dinosaurs, biblical view, evidence for dinosaurs and people, dire dragons, gigantic creatures in the fossil record that shows that things are not getting bigger and better. Many things are much less robust than their counterparts in the fossil record. And some of those are pre-flood, some of them are post-flood. And so conditions were quite good after the flood as well for several hundred years. Caves. Just some amazing stuff showing how quickly cave formations can form. What about their dating methods? I even discussed that, quoting them, showing that it's not the kind of dating methods that most people think. There's serious problems with these. Flood fossils, Noah's Ark, the rocks and fossils. And again, normally 160, if you want to get all four today, it's 120 plus 5% for our prime minister. And then if you want to buy individuals, they're 35 apiece, normally 40. And so that's our websites there. We have a sign-up sheet at the back there. If you want to follow our ministry, what are we doing? If you're interested in praying for us, you can sign up for our newsletter at the back via email. Let's just pray. Lord, I thank you that what we see in your world agrees with what we read in your word. And what we read in your word agrees with what we see in the world. Lord, you've given us a faith that fits the facts. And Lord, I praise you for that. And there are a lot of people around the world. Everybody has faith in something. And Lord, I just pray those who don't have faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, Lord, that you might stir their hearts, you might draw them to yourself. This I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we have a, thank you. So we have a couple minutes if there are any questions. If I know the answer, I'll tell you the answer. If I don't know, I'll just tell you I don't know. I don't believe in pretending you know when you don't know. So, any questions? No questions. Wow, we answered every single one. Ah, look at this one there. Yes, sir.
What does all earthers say about all this stuff that you're just saying?
Virtually nothing. Which you'll find, especially with the Tower of Babel stuff, if you bring it up, they've never actually thought about it. They don't actually even know about the evidence, most of them. What they'll try to do is, when it comes to swastikas, although it was a specific symbol with a specific meaning, the sun wheel early on, or the sun, worship of the sun. But then when you get further on, you'll find different groups that see the same symbol, use the same symbol, and mean something different, but the same thing. So far, I have not had anybody really give any pertinent challenge. Because for the most part, even though this has been around for a while, I've been researching this for a while, and as I pointed out, there's secular guys that are researching it too. So far, I can't answer that because I haven't really had any good questions about that. Now, of course, you would have to write a whole bunch of pages to try to refute it, and so far I don't see it. Any other questions? Yes?
Are there any dinosaurs left today?
Okay, yeah, good question. So if we have dinosaurs until recently, are there any dinosaurs around today? We can't say with certainty because you'd have to capture it, right? And now with AI, you can just tell your computer to make you a picture, which is quite impressive. And that's one of the reasons that in the books I tell you where almost everything is. So if you decided to go check out what I'm talking about, you can go check it out. And because we're getting into the era now where people are going to question everything with AI. But there have been, the last eyewitness account that I know of goes back to 2011, again in the Congo. And I know some people, and this is what they do, is they're looking for living dinosaurs. I call myself a fast food creationist because I need to get in, get the photographs, do the research, and get out. If I'm looking for something that moves, I like stuff that doesn't move, okay? So if you're looking for things that move, that could take your entire life and still not find it. What happened to them then? Well, I can tell you quite a bit about Europe because we have the most history in Europe, we have the most writings, we have the most paintings and all of those sorts of things in Europe. Not as much in North America, some in Central America, some in South America as well. But when I was studying the dinosaur depictions in old artwork, dinosaur and other supposedly extinct reptiles, what I discovered was in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, tons of them, tons of accurate depictions that match known fossils. And then you get to the middle of the 1600s and it starts to drop off a bit. And then by the time you hit the early 1700s, I have yet to find an accurate piece of artwork of a dinosaur or supposedly extinct reptile in the 1700s. Now, you sit back and you say, okay, well, what could have affected that? What could have affected them? I mean, obviously, they were living there with the Europeans. They didn't kill them all, although they probably killed some, because in the medieval mentality, they were demons. They saw these as demons. I won't get much more into that. But there was what's known as the Little Ice Age in Europe. And I suspect not just Europe, but other places. And so middle of the 1500s, the temperature starts to drop. Then eventually we get the Thames River in London freeze over for the first time known in history. And by the time we get to the 1700s, we don't see any more dinosaur depictions. And I think that these dinosaurs may not have been cold-blooded. They may not have been warm-blooded. The newest idea is that they may have been somewhere in between. I'm not sure with certainty, but it's called mesothermic. They're kind of in between. And it seems that they hung on for a longer period of time than a cold-blooded animal would have, but they eventually disappear, and that's why you don't see them in the artwork. And so it's, I believe, the Little Ice Age is kind of the key. What happened over here, what happened down in Central and South America, I'm not sure for sure. But it looks like they just keep dwindling like many other species have, and I'm not overly concerned about a particular species of insect, going extinct, or insects. Now some people are, but the same thing has been happening ever since sin, the curse, the flood. Creatures have been getting smaller, less robust, and some of them have disappeared. And so the very same thing with the dinosaurs. Now, was there a second part to that question, or another question that Okay. All right, one more at the back.
I'm familiar with, dating methods
Mm-hmm.
regarding layers and reasoning involved in that. But you mentioned carbon-14,
Mm-hmm.
and are there other more recent sophisticated methods of dating based on degeneration of the material, and how does that fit in?
Yeah, so there are different techniques, especially if you're dealing with rock art. And so the one example from Peru, and I'm not sure I even showed that today actually, but we worked together with an archaeologist there, and he did what's known as plasma oxidation. So that's to remove the organic pigment without removing the rock, because if you have calcium carbonate in the rock, that can throw the carbon-14 date out. But in the end, it was still carbon-14 dated. Now, carbon dating is not perfect, but it's very good in the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. And I've dated a lot of things to authenticate them for the Dire Dragons book. And I don't tell them what the culture is. I don't tell them what the time period is. I send a little piece of fabric away, and they come back, and every time they've nailed it. The problem is that when you get closer to the flood, the carbon-14 cycle would have been upset at the flood. And so you have, in the upper atmosphere, you have nitrogen-14, cosmic rays hit it, turn it into radioactive carbon-14, and then plants uptake regular carbon with a small percentage of this radioactive carbon. And so if you're eating plants, or you have something made out of plants, or you're a meat eater that eats an animal that eats plants, there's a certain percentage of carbon-14 in the hair, in the bones, in the skin, in the droppings. And then you can say, well, every 5,730 years, if we start with 1 gram, 5,730 years approximately, we have half a gram, and then so on and so forth. But after 5 half-lives, it becomes such an insignificant amount that you can no longer really figure out how old this thing is. It's not perfect, and the closer you get to the flood, the more things look older, because the pre-flood conditions and the post-flood conditions were obviously, early post-flood especially, were obviously quite different. And so your assumptions break down there. All right, well, I will be around for a little while, obviously. And so if you have any other questions, feel free to come and ask me and talk to me. My wife will be at the book table there for a while if you're interested in getting books. And like I said, we have a lot of people that give the books away to family and friends. And I remember this was back early on, and some people we knew, they bought the Dragon book, and they had a guy, friend, and so they give him the book, and he comes back and he says, now I can believe in God, now I can believe in the virgin birth. And I said, well, I never talked about proof, quote unquote, for the existence of God or the virgin birth. But you see, he had a problem with dinosaurs. Nobody was ever able to answer dinosaurs biblically. And when that was answered, that cleared away a lot of debris and say, hey, maybe I can trust that book. Maybe I can trust that Bible. And so you'll find that it's kind of pre-evangelism, clearing away the debris and allowing people to think. God does say, come let us reason together, and I know that's a particular context, so I don't want to get in trouble here. But nevertheless. All right, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.